Hey guys, Mike Lukic here. Thanks for joining me again today. Welcome to part 4 of my How to Use GTO Plus series. Today we're going to be talking about data aggregation and other advanced tips. Today is the final part of my four-part series. If you haven't seen the other 3 parts, I recommend that you go back and do so. Part 1 talks about setting up trees and just the basic configuration of the inputs that go into a GTO Plus decision tree. Part 2 talks about the outputs and how to interpret those outputs and work your way through the software. And part 3 talks about node locking, where we discuss manipulating different components of those trees to help develop better strategies to combat specific types of opponents. So as I mentioned today, we're going to talk about data aggregation and other advanced tips. We'll get into this throughout the video, but data aggregation means looking at a lot of different boards as opposed to one specific board. A lot of times when people jump into GTO Plus, they look at an individual spot, whether it's a flop, a turn, a river, and they look at very specific ranges and try to break down how to better construct ranges by looking at that specific spot. And it's a great tool to do so, as we covered in the first 3 parts of this series. But there's another level of study, a more macro level of study, where we can use GTO Plus to solve the same spot over a large number of different boards, whether it be a large number of different flops, a large number of different turns, etc., to try to see at a more macro perspective what overall frequencies should we take, both at equilibrium or based on the specific parameters that we input into the tree. So that's what I'm going to cover today for the most part, is how to use a database mode within GTO Plus, and how to take the data that's generated from there and start exporting that into other tools like Excel or Tableau or whatever the case may be, to do some further, more detailed analysis. I'll also wrap up the video by covering some just other small miscellaneous tips that I've picked up along the way to help better navigate the software and better get the most out of your use of GTO Plus. So with that said, let's just jump right into the video and start looking at the database mode. All right, so I've opened up GTO Plus, and this screen by now should look pretty familiar. And I've put in some basic parameters to start, but when you want to open up database mode, you actually have to start similar to the way in which you started in the first part of my series, and actually just build a tree. So you have to input ranges for both the out-of-position and in-position player. You have to put a board, and you actually have to build the parameters of the tree. So what I did here was I actually entered a scenario where we open from the middle position. So we opened from the middle position with this range. And again, the range doesn't really matter right now. This may or may not be realistic given different games, but we open with this specific range from middle position. We're called by a big blind with this range, and I've put a little bit of mixing in here to account for some spots where our opponents, we may have some uncertainty as to whether our opponents are going to either call or fold or call or raise in certain spots. So we have our 2 ranges. I put in just a random board, and the board doesn't matter, which you'll see in a second why. But the board doesn't matter at all, so you really can just put in random, and it doesn't really matter what we actually put in. And when I go to build a tree, I put in some of the details here. And again, this stuff doesn't matter specifically for the purpose of this video, but really what you want to make sure you do here is you're solving this tree across a large number of boards. You do want to make sure that the parameters are parameters that you're comfortable with. So I would actually spend more time building this out, but you also need to keep in mind that if you're solving this over multiple iterations, it's going to take a long time to solve across that many boards. So you want to keep that in mind. And for the purpose of this video, and I want to actually build this database. I've simplified the tree considerably just to show the functionality of a database mode. But I put in a spot where we have 100 big blind stacks. Our raise is to 3.5 big blinds, the big blind calls, and the small blind fold. So we have a 7.5 big blind pot. And then I just kept the default settings of 3/4 pots, which is really not very realistic for the actual game. But for the purposes of what we're doing, it's fine. So when you have all of this and you actually build your tree, and we would build our tree, we can get to this point here and we're going to click Run Solver. And every step up to this point is exactly the same, whether we're using database mode or whether we are actually building a tree. But instead of actually going and running the solver, what we're going to do here in this case is we're going to click on this Advanced tab. And you're going to see this second window pop up that gives us these advanced options where we can actually jump into database mode. So what you click here is Activate Database Mode. And that's going to give you a whole sort of options right here. And you're also going to see some of these icons pop up here on the left-hand side of the screen. So a couple things in here. You have icon 1, which is how you can add trees to the database or solve trees in the database. That basically just brings you to the screen. Number 2 is the graphical results, and it doesn't have any data in here now because we haven't solved anything yet. And then number 3 is adding the current tree to the database. So we could just hit plus, and that brings up this dialog box here, which we could add this specific tree, this Queen 6-4, into the database if we wanted to. And I would just click confirm, and you'll see it pop up within the database here too. So there's different things that we can actually do within this database from these 3 icons, and I'm actually just going to clear the database out from there. Most of the things that you'll actually do here are using these buttons within the database mode. So we've already covered clear database. So if you click this button, it takes everything within this database over here, and this is your database, the number of trees that we actually have, and clears everything out. The second thing is we can actually add a number of random flops. So suppose we wanted to build a database of 10 random flops. We could just type in 10 and click the button, and now we have 10 flops within our database. You'll see it'll say 10 trees and then the amount that are solved, and they all have these little icons next to it, and they're just kind of these gray check marks, and the legend is below, but you can see the ones that are not filled in are not solved yet. When they are solved, you'll see a green arrow that says they're solved. There are parts where it says the solve took too long. So there's this option down here where you can actually have the solver give up after a certain amount of time. So you might want to do this if you are solving a lot of boards and you don't necessarily want the solver to get hung on something that is going to spin out for a long period of time. So you have the solver give up after a period of time, and this icon would show up if that happened. Not enough memory would be exactly what you would think it would happen. If something pops up and we don't have enough memory to actually solve that particular tree, this icon would show up. And the last one, ignore this file. So you can right click on a tree to actually just have something ignored. So I could just right click on this and you'll see that this will pop up, and when we actually solve the database, it would ignore this specific tree in there. So we could add these random flops, and I'm going to clear the database again. We could also add specific flops. So let's say we wanted to type in 10 of hearts, 9 of diamonds, 6 of clubs, and we can just add that specific flop, and then that specific flop comes into the database. We can add our current tree into the database, which is just by clicking that button, it adds this current tree that we have there in the database. We could also change all flops to a certain board. So suppose I just wanted to change everything to ace of clubs, king of clubs, queen of clubs. And when I click this button, it changes this database to everything of the same flops. I'm really not sure why you would actually utilize that, but you can. And then finally, update all ranges. You can actually update all ranges in the database to the currently used settings. So if you have a bunch of things in a database where they're just different ranges, let's say you just continued adding different trees, you can just update everything to use all of the settings on this current specific tree. So that's great, and it's a good way of actually kind of one-off building a database. The part of this actually that I use the most is either importing flops from a file. So, suppose you had a list of flops that you actually want to import. You can put that in the GTO Plus folder and then type that the file name here. And when you click import, it actually can bring in the files into your database mode. You can also use this part to actually bring in some standard subsets that GTO Plus has put together. So you'll see these subsets that they have down here, 15, 19, 23, 33, etc. These are the number of flops in a subset, and they're strategically put together to try to model the entire game. So there's 1,755 unique flops in the game of Hold'em. We can certainly build a database by solving all 1,755, but that's going to take a significant amount of time. So what some people have done is they've built subsets of those 1,755 that are representative samples of the entire game, and utilize that to study those aggregated samples as opposed to actually studying the full 1,755. So I could type in something like 55 here, which is this 55, imports the flops, and you'll see that GTO Plus will now import the 55 flops as a part of that database, and actually I can actually use this as my subset as my database that I actually want to solve. So that's essentially how you would actually work this in the first place. I'm going to clear this again, and what I'm going to do instead now is I'm actually going to build the smallest one that I can. So I'm going to take this 15 flop subset, and I'm going to import my 15 flops, and we have our 15 flop subset. And when we are actually ready to solve, what we're going to do is we're going to solve this exactly the same way as we would solve a regular board. So first I'm going to change my accuracy to 1% because again, I'm going to want this to run a little bit faster. I might actually even make this 2%, so it just solves quicker for the purpose of this analysis. And when I'm ready, I can also choose basic storage or extensive storage. I'm going to choose the extensive storage, at least for this purpose. And again, this is just because when I do the extensive storage, I like to have the turn data stored. It just provides a little bit more detail when I'm actually diving into the analysis itself. And when I feel comfortable with all of this, I feel comfortable that I have my database subset. I feel comfortable about my target accuracy here. I have this running on 32 different threads. So I'm ready to actually run the solve. So what I'm going to do at this point here is just hit process database. You'll notice here also that my board is not in there, and that doesn't even matter, to be honest with you, at this point. As I mentioned here, we just put a random board in here to actually build a tree. What the database is going to do now is all of these are actually built based off of the specific ranges that we have within here. So these tree configurations are going to be utilized actually as the same parameters for every single flop within this database. So I'm going to hit process database, and you're going to see it start running. So our first solve here is running right now, and that's going to run until we get down to an accuracy of 2%. And that's going to happen in a couple seconds here. So when we finished and we finalize, you'll see this now turn into a green check mark. And now this next row is highlighted and the solver starts working on the next row. So I'm going to let this go for a little bit, and we are going to jump back in and take a look at the output after the 15 boards are solved. All right, so our 15 flops have all been solved, and we can confirm that by seeing all of these have green check marks. So, and we see also here that we have 15 trees, and in parentheses we see 15 have been solved. Now, there's a few ways we can actually navigate through this. So first we have this drop down here, which is flop filters. So when you actually expand on this, it's not necessarily as important when there are 15 trees in the database, but if you have a database that is much more significant, so I've done a lot of work with a 184 flop subset that is on the POSolver site. You may want to be able to navigate through those trees a little bit more effectively, and certainly if you built a database with all 1755 flops, you want to do that as well. But we can use these check marks to just call out specific flop types. So suppose we only want to look at rainbow flops. Well, we can actually cross those out, and now we only have the 5 rainbow flops that are shown here. Or if we only want the rainbow and two-tone flops, we have those, and then obviously the last one here is the only 3 flush or the monotone board that's there too. Same thing with paired versus unpaired. So we have 2 paired boards. We have the rest of these are unpaired boards. So and then we don't have any trip boards here. And then finally, we can only show boards that are based off of the top cards. So suppose we only want to show top cards, aces and kings and queens. Well, that would be all of these boards, and the rest of them are actually ignored. So there are different ways we can actually sort the components within this database. We can also dig into any of these trees itself. So by clicking on any of these, and I'll just look at this first one here, the 10-4 deuce, by double clicking on that, it doesn't look like it did anything, but what actually happened is we brought this board up, and when I actually click into the tree itself, we can see right here that this is the 10-4 deuce rainbow flop, and we can actually see the solver equilibrium output for this specific board. We can confirm that our tree is exactly the same. It still gives the options where this is our 3/4 pot, so the tree looks exactly the same, but it's for the 10-4 deuce board. And then if we want to get back to database mode, we just go back and click this database mode here, and we can do so by jumping back into here. We can go to a different flop. So let's say I want to go into this king jack 4 two-tone flop. Just double click that and go back into the tree, and now we see we're at the king jack 4 two-tone flop. So again, just it's a cool way we can actually now build this database where we now have 15 different solves that we can dive into any one of those individual solves and do the same things that we did in our previous couple videos, where we are really looking at the outputs of those individual boards, which is great. But that's not necessarily the power of this data aggregation mode. The power comes from when you actually go back to this display results in graph, which is the same thing as this button right here. You can click either one of these. And when you actually click one of those, what you're going to see is this tree come up first. And this is where I think you kind of start seeing the cool part about the data aggregation showing. And the graph is fine. But I think what's more interesting is actually looking at the specific components, because now you can actually see for each one of my individual trees, what is our equity and how does that vary from tree to tree. You can also use these filters to kind of to filter this as well too, and this is where the filtering is actually a little bit more is a little bit better. So maybe I want to look at this and see across all 15 of these flops, we have about 44% equity, but which our ace high flops also have around 44% equity. But if we're looking at our 10 high flops, those 10 high flops, we actually have player one has about more like 47 to 48% equity here. So you can start analyzing this based off of the different types of boards. So we have our equity, our EV, and then we also have the frequencies that the players are taking at each point in the hand. So right now we're looking at this from player one's perspective, which is the big blind. So not surprisingly, we don't expect the big blind to be leading into an uncapped middle position opening range very frequently. And across all 15 of these flops, it only happens at equilibrium about 4% of the time. But on some boards that are potentially more favorable for the big blind caller, a board like 10-9-6 two-tone here, you're going to see a little bit more leading or donk betting by our big blind calling range. We can also look at player two, and player two, we actually don't see. All we see here is the equity and the EV, and we don't see what player two's strategic options are. And the reason is because we haven't gotten to those nodes yet, and it really depends on what player one does first. So the cool thing about this is we can actually click on one of these two parts of the tree to advance to the next stage. So let's say player one checks, which is going to happen the majority of the time, 96% of the time. Now we move forward to, and it automatically switches over to player two. We can see player two's aggregate value. So when player one checks at equilibrium across all of these boards, this is what player two's equity is on each one of these boards, as well as player two's EV, the frequency at which they are betting this 2/3 pot, and then the frequency at which they are checking. So you can start taking a look at which are the types of boards that player two is going to be betting more frequently, and I'm going to actually sort them by this column here. We can see that these dry rainbow boards, 9-4-3, Jack 3 deuce, 8-5-3, boards in which are in position, middle position range is going to be c betting at a higher frequency than if we sort it by the check function. Our monotone boards, some of our two-tone ace high boards, that's 10-9-6 two-tone boards. So some of these kind of more dynamic or draw heavy boards, we're going to be checking back more at equilibrium as the middle position raiser. And we can continue doing this for all steps in the tree. So that's for when the big blind checks. What if the big blind leads out? And we can now specifically look at, well, what is our equity and EV against a lead in these spots at equilibrium with an equilibrium range? And what is the frequency at which we raise, call, or fold at equilibrium as that middle position raiser? So really cool way of being able to take a look at all of this data here. And I'll get into how to actually export this and use this in a couple moments. We can use this tab here, which is the specific hand. So you can actually select a starting hand or actually look at the entire range. So if we want to take a look at a starting hand, like say, ace of hearts, king of clubs, you can actually look at, how that specific hand would fare across all of these boards, which, to be honest with you, I find a little bit less useful. But it can be helpful in its right moments if you're trying to understand how to play a specific hand in a variety of different spots. But you can also, I think this third tab here, which I think is a great tab, is the aggregate view, which now we have a few different visualizations. We have the aggregate view at all of the hands. So this tab here first shows every single hand across all of these different boards. Um, for Now we're looking at player one's range, but maybe we want to look at player two's range. All of our hands, the equity and EV for each of those hands. This second view here at aggregate shows this in a more grid view, where we can actually display the equity of all of our hands, or the EV of all of our hands, which is a cool way of visualizing where our EV tends to come from here, which, as player two, you can really see that for the most part, the majority of our EV comes from hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, and we kind of start fading off. And even hands like our ace kings, ace queens, in the more middling in EV range, especially compared to aces, the difference between ace king suited and a hand like 7-5 suited, not as significant as the difference between a hand like aces and ace king suited. So you definitely see just a bump in the and how top heavy the EV is weighted towards these top end hands when you look at it in a view like this. And then finally, this graph this graph icon here shows our entire tree. And again, this I think is a really cool view to show frequencies aggregated across all 15 flops for our entire tree. So now we see across our entire tree, you'll remember that the big blind leads into the middle position player about 4% of the time, checks about 96% of the time, and so on and so forth. We can see the frequencies that each player would take at equilibrium for the entire tree. So it's a really cool way of actually visualizing all of this. The last thing that I'm going to want to show here is how do you actually take this and do something with this data. So we have this nice database, but we really can't manipulate this database and do a lot of further analysis within this database. And that's where GTO Plus, the functionality of GTO Plus ends, and a data analysis tool like something like Excel or Tableau is going to come in much more handy. So what I'm going to do is just show how do we actually get this data into a tool like that. And I'm just going to use Excel for this, but really you can use any tool you want or any database that you want. You can put this into your own database where you can do some much more advanced work on this data. But for the purpose of this demonstration, just showing how to get this out of GTO Plus and putting this into a separate place is good enough. I may make a video at some point where we actually take this data and spend the entire video within a more just data analysis software, within a data analysis software, to actually show how we can actually manipulate this data a little bit more effectively. But you'll see that there is this button here on the bottom right here. And if you click on this button, what it's going to do is it's going to show you this, it's going to bring up this little screen. And it looks just like a bunch of numbers, but if you dive into this and actually take a look at the data in here compared to this, it's just a copy of the data that we actually see within this database. So I can just hit Control C or right click and copy, or really however I want to copy this, and switch over to an Excel file and just paste this in. So I'm just going to hit Control V. Now what you'll see here is a couple things. So first and foremost, the way in which the numbering methodology it happens here is GTO Plus has this set as a lot of commas in here as opposed to decimal points. This should be decimal points, but it's a number of commas. You could actually instead click this button here and it will change over to decimal points. So this is based on if you are in different countries, there's different ways of writing decimal points or commas and purposes for that. So you have to click this first, and I'm going to actually just copy paste this again and re-copy paste this over the top. And now you see it actually just is a little bit more effective. The data is there. It's just the way I have this set up is it numbers things differently. But now that you have this in Excel, you'll also notice that there are no headers on any of these, so you do have to actually put the header row in here yourself. But now, once the data is in Excel, I can do other things that I want to this data. So, for instance, let's say I want to actually calculate the EQR in this. POSolver gives you the EQR, but it's pretty easy to calculate. It's easy to calculate otherwise. I can just take my formula for EQR, which is just EV divided by the equity, and I have to do this divided by 100 because this equity needs to be in terms of a percent, times the pot size, which is 7.5, and what I'll get is the EQR in this spot for our out of position player. And what we see here is that this value being less than 1 or less than 100% in this spot here means that the out of position player, the big blind, is going to under realize his or her equity, which is not surprising, and that's exactly what we would expect anyways. And I can just copy paste this all the way down and really see now I'm doing additional work here within Excel, and I'm showing additional information using this data. And the possibilities here are endless. We can start displaying things more graphically. We can do a lot more detailed analysis, but it all really stems from our initial database that we've created right here, which this is the source data, and these are the main primary metrics that we're going to utilize, and then from there we can start manipulating and doing a lot more advanced analysis work. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that's a good overview of the database mode. I think the database mode is a great way to actually dive into a lot of different boards. And when you do dive into a lot of different boards, you can get a lot of great insights that you can take away from things, not just in one specific nuanced spot, but start building strategies for how you might attack an overall formation. How might you build out an overall plan for this middle position versus big blind formation? How might you build out an overall big blind defense strategy? We're not always going to see the same flops over and over again, and there's 1,755 different flops. Very often, we're going to go after we see a flop once, we may not see that same flop for a long period of time again. So by studying individual flops, yes, we can extract some great concepts and utilize that across the entire game, but it's also important to understand how should we be building our strategy more from a macro perspective as well too. All right, so the last thing I wanted to just cover was just a couple final just tips and tricks that I've found along the way to be pretty helpful. The first is when we actually dive into the accuracy of this. A lot of times GTO Plus gives you these three options. So 0.5%, 0.25%, 0.1%. And they're great. All of these, you can use any one of these and it's going to be very accurate. Even 0.5% is a really good degree of accuracy. What I find a lot though is, especially when you get into deeper trees where the stack sizes are a lot deeper, the stack to pot ratio is a lot larger, maybe we have a lot more bet size options, those trees can take a long time to calculate. So I found that you don't have to go down to this level of accuracy the majority of the time. And I think generally changing this to about 1% is, I use 1% as a general rule of thumb, but you can go to 2% if you want, and really, up to a few percent and be fine. If you think about it, the the margin of error that we have in terms of all of the inputs that we put into the boards, that we put into our configuration. So we are assuming a lot of things with ranges. We are assuming a lot of things with bet configurations. We're making a lot of assumptions in our inputs. To think that we're going to be able to get to a 0.5% accuracy with all of those potential assumption errors that we may make is silly, to be honest with you. So because there's a lot of a margin of error in all of our inputs, we can also assume a margin of error in the output as well too. So it's I have not found a significant difference by solving down to a 1 or 2% than I would to solve to a 0.5 or 0.25%. If you're running a basic tree, sure, solve it at a more accurate level, and that's fine. But as the tree becomes more complex and it takes much more time to actually get down to a solve within those accuracy parameters, you're going to save yourself a lot of time by giving yourself a little bit more of a margin of error. And honestly, you're going to get some diminishing returns based on that time if you try to solve to a more accurate level. The next thing I would make sure that you're taking a look at is this value down here, memory needed for solving. And this, again, is going to be significant to help you get to a point where you're building trees that are being solved effectively and they are not taking a lot of time to actually solve. So this is a pretty basic tree. It's only going to take, it's not going to take much time. It only needs about 710 megabytes. I'm never going to run into memory issues. You can see this is where your memory your memory capacity lies, and I have 128 gigs in my computer. So I'm never really going to run into any problems here. But if you do have a device that maybe only has like 8 gigs or even less, you're going to run into some issues as you have some more complex trees. So keep an eye on your memory needed for solving, and you'll notice that there are certain things that drive up the memory. So as I start adding some custom settings, once I add multiple bet sizes on a flop, you're going to see that go up, right? So I add 2 bet sizes, and now this goes up somewhat significantly. I add a 3rd bet size, and it's going to go up again. So as I add complexity, my memory needed for solving is actually going to go up. It's also going to go up as I add more complexity early in the tree. So if I add 2 bet sizes on the river, it doesn't go up as much as it does when I add it on the flop. So you can actually add more complexity later in streets and be okay. But when you start adding multiple bet sizes on flops, that's when you're going to start seeing much more of an increase into the memory needed for actually solving things. So just keep an eye on that. The third tip I'll make is do make sure that you spend some time looking through the tree navigation and then actually editing the tree this way too. So I went through this in the last video, but there's a lot of additional steps in here. And this is, again, a very simple tree, but as you start building out more complex trees, you're going to see a lot of steps. And if you leave it at the default level, what'll happen, especially is if you're really deep, you're going to get into scenarios where there's a bet, there's a raise, there's a re-raise, there's a re-raise, and then there's continued re-raises until you're actually all in, which very, very rarely happens in actual gameplay. So you can actually start removing nodes of game trees to simplify things somewhat, but also make things more realistic. So I definitely recommend spending some time editing trees. And again, you see this memory needed for solving. It's up here. By editing components of the tree, you can actually get to a spot where you can cut down on this memory needed for solving, and by also making a tree that's much more specific to what you actually need. And the final thing, I guess, a tip that I want to give is it's useful when you want multiple bet sizes to run a solve, a more simplified version of the solve. So let's say you wanted to look at a few different bet sizes on the flop to see what the solver preferred. And let's say you chose a small bet size, a large bet size, and a medium bet size. And what the solver did was allocated combos into the small bet size and the large bet size, but really ignored the medium bet size. Well, if that's the case, what you can do is run the solve again by just taking out the middle bet size. It's a way in which you can actually really simplify things and make the solve run a lot more quickly. So definitely try iterating, playing around. But if you're seeing options where the solver unilaterally is just not choosing that option, or it dumps all of the combos into a certain option, you can remove options that are not chosen as they're clearly shown, at least at an equilibrium perspective, to be a dominated option in that spot there. And then actually the last point I will make too is if you are choosing multiple bet sizes, make sure those bet sizes are have some degree of separation from one another. So an example of this is if you're choosing two bet sizes on the flop, you're not going to see a very big difference if you choose a 40% bet size and a 50% bet size. You'd want to choose something that's more like a small bet size of maybe 30% and a larger bet size of maybe 70%. By giving a little bit more separation, you're actually making them two different configurations. So, and you're giving the solver two different options that are far enough apart from one another that they actually mean different things, and the solver is going to allocate those effectively. Whereas if the values that you inputted are 40% and 50%, the solver may see those as two very, very similar options and just spread and mix combos across those two bet sizes somewhat equally. So, again, this is just some things that I've found along the way to help simplify the game trees that you're actually putting together, but also make sure that you're getting the most valuable outputs, and you're taking those outputs and you're able to get the most insights out of those outputs as well. So that's all I had to cover in this video. I hope that you enjoyed this video of the database mode and just some of these miscellaneous tips. And I hope you enjoyed this series of going through GTO Plus. I hope it was helpful. A lot of you may be either new to GTO Plus, new to solvers, or just have used it and really are just looking for a refresher of how do you actually get more out of these individual tools. Hopefully this video series has been helpful and can be helpful for those of you out there who are looking to dive into solvers more and really get the most out of them as a part of your poker studies. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment below, like the video, subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. If you're watching this on YouTube as well, you can take a look over to my website, lukic.io. Have a lot of great data-driven work there. And if you're watching this on the website, thank you for visiting the website. I'm not sure exactly when, but I plan on creating another one of these series, but this time either for PO Solver or for I've been thinking about jumping into the simple three-way solver, which I haven't dug into yet, but I'm really interested in diving into it and spending a little bit of time in that as well too. So I may create some video series that are similar in different solver types, but I wanted to start with GTO Plus as I actually do think it's one of the best solvers out there on the market, and I definitely think it's the best solver on the market for the value that you get from it. The price point is really, really, really good, and it does the majority of the things that all of those other solvers out there do, for a fraction of the price. So I do highly recommend it, and it's a great tool. So. If you have any other questions, leave them in the comments. Shoot me an email. Let me know. Happy to dive in. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.